Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, January 24th, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Steve Witkoff to lead Iran negotiations. So Financial Times reported on Thursday that President Trump is expected to put his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, in charge of the Iran file in the new administration, a sign that they're going to try some diplomacy with Iran before exploring any military options, hopefully. Sources told Financial Times that Witkoff, who put pressure on Israel to clinch the Gaza ceasefire deal, will be tasked to pursue diplomacy with Iran as part of a broader push to end the wars in the Middle East, which that sounds good to me. So during the transition phase, Trump officials told the media that they were planning to return to the maximum pressure campaign against Iran that Trump pursued in his first term, which involved pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, imposing crippling sanctions, and assassinating Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. But in a sign that Trump may take a different approach, he just fired Brian Hook, who's an Iran hawk who led the maximum pressure campaign in the first administration, the first Trump administration. And now we see this reports, and there's multiple reports saying that Witkoff is going to be in charge of Iran, of potential negotiations with Iran. And, we've also seen during the transition phase, I covered it a lot on this show, all these reports saying that the Trump administration is considering direct military action on Iran's nuclear program to prevent Iran from building a nuclear weapon. But there's still no evidence that Iran seeks a nuclear bomb. And this is something that was recently acknowledged by William Burns, who was Biden's CIA chief, he went out the door. It was one of his last interviews as a CIA chief. He reaffirmed that they have no evidence that Iran is looking to build a bomb. So the hype about Iran's nuclear program is focused on the uranium enrichment levels. They're enriching some uranium at 60% purity, which is the highest level Iran's done. They started that 4 years ago now in 2021, because it was when the Biden administration first came in and they started these indirect negotiations with Iran. And then Israel conducted a covert attack on one of Iran's nuclear facilities. And then in response, they started the 60% uranium enrichment. So that was a long time ago at this point. But that's what all the kind of the hype is about. But the 60% is still lower than the 90% needed for weapons grade uranium, so still no actual move toward making a nuclear weapon. And as I always like to mention when we talk about this topic, Iran is also a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Israel is not, because they have a secret nuclear weapon stockpile. Unlike Iran, Israel actually has nuclear weapons. So Axios reported that Iran made clear to European diplomats in a recent meeting that they want to resume negotiations on a new nuclear deal that will be different from the 2015 agreement. The 2015 agreement capped Iranian uranium enrichment at 3.67%. And so if, say, Witkoff, comes in and tries to pursue a deal with Iran, Iran's new government seems very open to this idea. He's going to face a lot of resistance from the Iran hawks within the Trump administration, because there's a lot of them in very high-level positions like Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz. And he's also going to face resistance from Republicans in Congress. They're already complaining about him. A senior Republican congressional staffer told Financial Times, quote, "He's already lifting pressure on Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, and in the process abandoning American hostages and endangering Israel," end quote. Even though he's the one who got the hostage deal, they're saying that he's abandoning hostages. But the people who are bombing the hostages, I would say, were abandoning them. So, Witkoff has been an interesting character so far. I like the way he operates. Reason maybe for some less negativity toward how this administration is going to handle Iran, but you never know how things shape out. I remember in the early days of the Biden administration, there was some hope, some signs that they might pursue a deal with Iran. Of course, that didn't go anywhere, and look at how things turned out. But a good sign that Witkoff might be put in another position like that, because he just seems very open to talks, to diplomacy. All right, the next one here, a not so good thing, a not so good sign. Trump redesignates the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. So on Monday, President Trump signed an executive order redesignating Yemen's Houthis, also known as Ansar Allah, as a foreign terrorist organization, a move that will impede aid deliveries to Yemen and complicate the chances of a lasting peace deal between the Saudis and the Houthis. The FTO designation makes it a crime under U.S. law to provide material support or resources to the Houthis, essentially making it illegal to deliver aid to Houthi-controlled Yemen, which is where 70% to 80% of Yemenis live. You know, people might look at a map of Yemen and see the area that the Houthis control and say, oh, that's a small part of Yemen. What about all this part in the east here? But it's where most people live, and the parts in the east are just desert, pretty much. And so this is something that this designation was first put on the Houthis by the Trump administration, the last Trump administration in 2021. And so it's a little confusing here. So this is the foreign terrorist organization designation. There's also the specially designated global terrorist designation. And in 2021, the Trump administration put both on the Houthis. And then the Biden administration came in and they lifted it pretty quickly. And they did that because aid groups were warning that it was going to push millions into famine. It was when the Saudi blockade and war was still, at full strength. And so the Biden administration lifted both designations, but then last year they put on the specially designated global terrorist designation when they started the bombing campaign against the Houthis. So now, they're pretty similar. They're pretty similar in what the penalties are. The specially designated one makes people subject to sanctions, U.S. financial sanctions, if they do business with the Houthis. So that impedes aid deliveries as well. But the foreign terrorist organization is considered harsher because it makes it a crime to deliver aid to the Houthi-controlled areas, because the Houthis are the government of that part of Yemen, which includes the capital and, again, where most people live. So this is not a good sign. And the executive order that Trump signed said that it is, quote, the policy of the United States to cooperate with its regional partners to eliminate Ansar Allah's capabilities and operations, deprive it of resources, and thereby end its attacks on U.S. personnel and civilians, U.S. partners in maritime shipping in the Red Sea, end quote. Well, since the Gaza ceasefire went into effect, we haven't seen any more Houthi attacks. So let's hope that the calm continues, that the Gaza ceasefire continues, because that's the key to everything in the region. And another thing, this designation is blocking a peace deal. The Saudis and the Houthis agreed on a peace deal that pleased all parties in Yemen, and they were ready to sign it, but then the U.S. put on that designation last year. And the first phase of the agreement, the peace deal, is for civil workers, government workers that live in Houthi-controlled Yemen to get paid. They haven't been paid in many years, and the U.S. sanctions block that from happening. So these designations are blocking a lasting peace deal in Yemen. All right, so the next one here, Israel's multi-front war is focused on the West Bank. So the head of Israel's Shin Bet security agency said Thursday that Israel's multi-front war is now focused on the occupied West Bank amid a new Israeli siege on the northern Palestinian city of Jenin. So this is Shin Bet chief Ronan Bar. He said it's focused on Samaria, which is the biblical name for the northern West Bank. Bar made the comments while visiting Israeli troops with Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, the head of the Israeli military. He's stepping down in a few months, but he said that Israeli forces must be ready for continuous operations in Jenin. And one thing they're doing is destroying the roads, tearing up some infrastructure. You could see from this picture, these are people fleeing the Jenin refugee camp amid the Israeli assault, and you see the road is all torn up. So at least 12 Palestinians have been killed in Jenin since Israel launched its renewed assault on the city on Tuesday. Resistance groups have said they're engaging with the invading Israeli troops, but so far there's been no word of Israeli casualties. Jenin Deputy Governor Mansour al-Saadi said Thursday that Israeli forces had blockaded all 4 entrances to the city and its refugee camp. Hundreds of Palestinians in the refugee camp have been forced to flee their homes. So al-Saadi warned that the attack could be a repetition of what's happening in the northern Gaza Strip, a systematic campaign of extermination. An Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, has said that Israel is applying lessons that it learned in Gaza in its assault on the West Bank. And the Israeli military launched this assault just 2 days after the Gaza ceasefire took effect. The attack also came after the Palestinian Authority was conducting a major operation in Jenin as part of a crackdown on resistance groups. The PA withdrew when Israel began its invasion, but there are reports that the PA forces have been involved in the Israeli attack on the city. According to the Cradle, the PA killed a resistance fighter in Jenin on Wednesday night. So the Palestinian Authority seems to be directly collaborating with the Israeli forces. All right, so the next one here, Israel wants to extend troops' stay in Lebanon another 30 days. So this article is from Jason Ditz. Just 1 day after Israel's foreign minister was saying they are committed to the ceasefire in Lebanon, multiple media reports say Israel is now seeking an additional 30 days to keep troops in Lebanon beyond the 60-day deadline for the pullout currently in place. The 60-day deadline is extremely close at this point and will be in effect overnight Sunday into Monday. Israel has to withdraw from a handful of villages, which they had more or less totally destroyed. They remain in scores and towns of villages, including some they first invaded after the ceasefire began. The U.S. guaranteed that Israel would meet that deadline, but it seems like at this point they will not. And Hezbollah says that they are, going to respond if Israeli troops are still there. And now there's reports saying that the U.S. is reluctant, does not want to let Israel extend this, and they want them to finish the ceasefire by Sunday. That's what the Israeli media reports are saying, that President Trump wants them to get out, to withdraw by Sunday. And I hope that they're dealing with Witkoff in this situation again. All right, so the next one here, Israel purchases more Iron Dome interceptors with U.S. aid. So the Israeli Defense Ministry announced last week that it had signed its first deal using an $8.7 billion military aid package it received from the U.S. to purchase munitions for its Iron Dome missile defense system. The Defense Ministry said it signed a contract with the Israeli arms maker Rafael on January 16th. The ministry did not say how much the deal was worth, but noted that $5.2 billion out of the $8.7 billion it received from the U.S. was allocated to go toward Israel's missile defense systems. The Israeli Defense Ministry first announced in September 2024 that it had received this $8.7 billion from the U.S., and this came from the $95 billion foreign military aid bill President Biden signed into law in April 2024. Israel, I think they're the only country that is allowed to purchase non-U.S. weapons with U.S. military aid. Since October 7, 2023, the U.S. has provided Israel with at least $22 billion in military aid, which supported the genocidal war in Gaza, Israel's war in Lebanon, operations in Syria, the West Bank, and attacks on Iran and Yemen. Whenever I list out all of the different areas, I always forget one. When I first wrote this, I forgot to add Yemen in there. Israel's launched multiple airstrikes in Yemen. This is, again, this was announced last week during the final week of the Biden administration. But, we saw that foreign assistance. Trump paused the foreign development assistance. That's not expected to have any impact on military aid to Israel. All right, so the next one here, Gaza hospitals receive 122 more bodies, so that death toll continues to go up. So Gaza's health ministry said Thursday that hospitals received 122 more bodies as Palestinians continue to dig the remains of people killed by Israel's bombing campaign out of the rubble on the 5th day of the ceasefire. The health ministry said that 120 of the bodies were dug out of the rubble and 2 Palestinians were killed in the previous 24-hour period. Gaza's civil defense reported that 2 Palestinians were killed by Israeli tank fire in the south despite the ceasefire. So by my count, that's at least 6 Palestinians killed since the ceasefire went into effect by Israeli forces. And that's just from what I've seen in the media reports. So the fresh bodies brought the ministry's number of Palestinians killed by Israeli forces since October 2023 to 47,283. You see this picture here. This is a Palestinian soccer player, Ahmed Al-Lulahi, searching his home for his belongings under the rubble, and this is in Rafah. And, you know, as we're always talking about with these health ministry numbers, they only account for the dead and wounded that were brought to hospitals. So that means every time a body is brought to the hospital that gets dug out of the rubble, it's going to be added to the death toll. And it's not clear if they're all getting counted, because in some cases they just find a few bones or something and then they bury the remains right where they're found, you know, right near where they're found. So we don't know if everything's getting counted. So, and then according to that Lancet study, they believe the real death toll is over 70,000. Al Jazeera reported that during the first 4 days of the ceasefire, 3,200 trucks had entered Gaza, which is a significant surge in deliveries, but there have been issues with distribution, and Palestinians are still suffering greatly because they have no real shelter, living in these worn-down tents, and the infrastructure has just been totally destroyed. It's just no place for people to live. All right, so the next one here, U.S. private security contractors to operate checkpoint in Gaza. So Axios reported on Thursday that armed U.S. private security contractors will begin operating a checkpoint in Gaza in the coming days. The report said U.S. contractors will be deployed to Gaza as part of a multinational group that's been established by the Gaza ceasefire deal and is backed by the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt. Initially, the deployment will involve 2 private American companies. One is called Safe Reach Solutions and UG Solutions. So these are essentially American mercenaries, likely former military, who are going to be manning a checkpoint in Gaza. The third company is an Egyptian firm that's backed by Egyptian intelligence. The contractors will operate a checkpoint at the Netzarim corridor, a strip of land just south of Gaza City, where the Israeli military has demolished nearly every building in sight and established military bases. As part of the hostage deal, Hamas wanted Palestinians forcibly displaced from northern Gaza to be able to pass freely through the corridor from the south. Israel demanded that its forces must inspect every Palestinian that passes through, and the compromise apparently was for a private security firm to do the inspections. So this is something that they're saying is going to happen within a few days, and there's expected to be out of there by the end of the first phase of the ceasefire. And you know, we talk about the north. From what I've seen, I haven't seen any reports that they've actually let Palestinians from the south go through the Netzarim corridor yet. But it does look like Palestinians in Gaza City have been able to go to the northern cities that they completely destroyed as part of that general's plan, that cleansing campaign. And that's Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, and Jabalia. You see this view of one of these cities from Israel, just how destroyed it is. So this is something I'm sure, because there's elements of the Israeli government that, you know, we're hoping this general's plan would lead to total ethnic cleansing and the establishment of Jewish settlements. So I think there's probably a lot of opposition to actually letting the Palestinians in the south cross that Netzarim corridor. So, you know, I think there's just I think there's a good chance of them trying to sabotage the ceasefire deal because of this. So, all right, the next one here. Trump wants denuclearization with Russia and China. So on Thursday, President Trump delivered a virtual address to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and said he wanted to discuss the idea of denuclearization with Russia and China. The president claimed that during his last term in office, he discussed the idea of denuclearization with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Although his previous administration withdrew from arms control treaties with Russia, including the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. So what actually happened when he was last president was arms control collapsed. But he's saying that he talked about, he had this discussion with Putin about the idea of them, he's saying denuclearization, but it sounds like he's saying the discussion was reducing their nuclear stockpiles, which would be absolutely great and wonderful, and is something I hope he actually pursues. Trump said, quote, "We were talking about denuclearization of our two countries, and China would have come along. China right now has a much smaller nuclear armament than us, but they're going to be catching up at some point. I will tell you that President Putin really liked the idea of cutting back on nuclear, and I think the rest of the world, we would have gotten them to follow, and China would have come along too. China also liked it. Tremendous amounts of money are being spent on nuclear, and the destructive capability is something that we don't even want to talk about. It's too depressing," end quote. So today, only one nuclear arms control treaty remains between the U.S. and Russia, the New START, which limits the number of nuclear warheads and launchers that each country can have deployed. Under President Biden, New START was suspended, but both the U.S. and Russia have continued to comply with the limits set by the treaty, which expires in 2026. So another thing about the previous Trump administration was that he had this arms control envoy, this guy, Marshall Billingsley, who was put in charge of negotiating a replacement to New START or whatever. It had a built-in extension. New START was supposed to expire in 2021, and then they had the option to renew it for 5 years. So another one of Biden's first moves, this was just a few days in office, he came in and he got on the phone with Putin, and they agreed to extend New START. So that was another thing. Looking back, we see positive things with the Trump administration in the first few days. We actually did see some positive things with Biden too, and then look how that turned out. So anyway, I don't want to be too negative, but anyway, the Trump administration, so it looked like his arms control people were purposely going to let New START lapse, and then there would have been no nuclear arms control treaties. They were trying to sabotage it, it seemed like. They were asking China to get involved in the talks, but China has nowhere near the amount of nukes that the U.S. and Russia have, and they were refusing to, negotiate a deal without China, and Russia was saying, let's work on our own thing, and then we could bring China in. So, but it seemed like they were working to sabotage it. But if this is something Trump actually wants to do, he's got to do it. First thing is ending the war in Ukraine, ceasefire, but I'm not sure when that's going to happen. All right, so the next one here. Oh, that's another thing I should have mentioned. He said at the World Economic Forum, he addressed them via video. He said, called for the war to end and everything. All right, so the next one here, NATO chief says the alliance must step up support for Ukraine. So this is one from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said Thursday, that NATO members must increase support for Ukraine and change the trajectory of the war. He asserted that spending more now will save trillions of dollars that will need to be spent if Kiev lost the war. Speaking on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum, Rutte argued Western states must step up and not scale back the support they are sending to Kiev. This is amazing. He's saying we have to change the trajectory of the war. And essentially what he's saying is we have to give Ukraine more military aid and increase sanctions on Russia. It's going to make some big difference. But this is what Rutte wants to do. He's been saying lately, I'm sick of all this talk about peace talks. We got to focus on arming Ukraine and sending them weapons. He's like, I don't even want to hear about it. But hopefully Rutte's advice goes, I'm sure Trump's not going to listen to his advice. And I just hope that more and more members of NATO, European members of NATO, start to come around to the idea of, it's time to end this war. Because I think that would help move the process along if more of them got on board. All right, so the last one here, Pentagon deploys 1,500 troops to the southern border. So this is another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. So the acting Secretary of Defense ordered 1,500 Marines and soldiers to the southern border to help enforce U.S. immigration law. President Donald Trump has made curbing the flow of migrants entering the U.S. a top priority. The new administration is considering increasing the deployment to 10,000 troops. On Wednesday, acting Defense Secretary Robert Salesses, so he's the acting Defense Secretary, and he, I don't really know anything about him, but it looks like Hegseth is getting confirmed, or he might have gotten confirmed already, I forget. Anyway, so he ordered 500 Marines and 100 soldiers from the Army to the border. Initially, the troops will be limited to roles assisting border enforcement agents, including conducting deportation flights, helicopter patrols over the southern border, and constructing barriers. He said that the goal is the complete operational control of the southern border. So eventually, I guess they want the military to be in total control. And under this law that President Biden invoked, he can order. There's actually a law that Kyle's mentioning a law here that the president cannot order troops to enforce the law on U.S. soil. Presidents have frequently deployed troops to the border to aid immigration enforcement. However, Trump is considering invoking the 1807 Insurrection Act, which would allow the president to order soldiers to engage in law enforcement on U.S. soil. So it looks like 1,500 troops initially, but they want to increase the deployment up to 10,000. That would be a pretty significant deployment on the southern border. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Pietro A. Shakarian, the Russo-Persian Partnership Pact, significance and implications, about that deal that Iran and Russia just signed. One from Michael C. Monson, Gaza, a perception gap. One from Stan Cox, when Israeli warplanes rain death, the co-pilot is Uncle Sam. One from Andrew Byers, the unintended consequences of U.S. intervention in Libya. And one from John Kuriakow, pardon me for being angry about him not being pardoned by President Biden. So please go check all of that out. That is it for me for today. That's it for the week. I hope everybody has a good weekend. You could always support the show by sharing it, like, subscribe, comment. All that stuff helps out. Follow us on social media. Again, I hope everyone has a good weekend. I'll be back with some more news in a few days. Let's hope the Gaza ceasefire holds. Let's hope a Lebanon withdrawal happens. Let's hope a ceasefire in Ukraine happens. I'll be back soon. Thanks for listening.